what's coming to mind for me is the word fear. So I think most people who are going through this process in a contentious way are experiencing that contention or even causing that contention because of fear, right? The unknown is so scary. What's going to happen to my life? How am I going to manage? Why are you doing this to me? Kind of thing. How am I going to live? And I think that is what I think triggers the animosity and the conflict. And so if we can help clients to really understand what needs to be in place for them to feel safe, feel capable of moving forward, they do better.
Hi, I'm Rachel Green, Brooklyn-based divorce mediator and collaborative attorney, and this is my podcast, Keep the Kids in Mind. Join me as I chat with other industry professionals about everything from smoothly navigating your way through divorce to prenups, all the while keeping the kids in mind. I'm Rachel Green, and welcome to Keep the Kids in Mind, a podcast where I speak to other divorce professionals about families, restructuring, and in transition. And I'm very pleased to have Randy Heller as our guest today. Dr. Randy Heller received her doctorate in family therapy from Nova Southeastern University and wrote her dissertation on the role of the mental health professional working in collaborative divorce. So, Randy, you must be one of the real originators of this whole process because collaborative divorce is fairly new. Randy has held numerous positions as an educator and a family therapist and a student specialist, and she's a marriage and family therapist licensed in Florida, New York, and Connecticut. And she also worked as a parenting coordinator and reunification specialist. I'm very pleased, Randy, that you are able to join us today.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So just to begin, I'm wondering if you could tell us what has called you to do this work, what drives you, what has led you to want to spend time with people who are sometimes crying and shouting at each other and struggling with the pain of breakup and at the same time restructuring their families.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And all of that, that's my answer, all of that. That these people are really, really struggling and really, really hurting and need guidance in how to move forward in their lives so that they, as well as if they have children, can move forward in their lives in a productive and effective way. I've been a clinician for over 30 years, and oftentimes what I was seeing early on in my practice was people who were coming in and saying, fix my child, we had a terrible divorce, or help me, I can't move forward in my life, I can't be in a relationship, I don't know how to do that, or my ex-spouse and I cannot work together to co-parent our kids, I hate him, I hate her, she's so this, she's so that. And so what I was seeing was a real destruction of generations of families, not just the core family. But then later on, as we know, that these patterns really, really repeat themselves in families. And so it was really my goal and my hope to find a better way for families so that we could help them on the front end of their process. We could help them in the beginning with how to do things that clearly people who are getting divorced don't know how to do, right? So I say to people who are getting divorced at the onset, if you two knew how to communicate well, solve problems, raise your children on the same page, and be respectful of one another, you probably wouldn't be getting divorced.
Right.
So given that notion, let's recognize that you need help with this. And helping them, to my mind, really not only helps them, but helps them to be better parents and co-parents, helps them to be better individuals. And maybe a lofty goal helps to change, the trajectory of families one at a time. And that's important to me.
Yeah, that's that you just said so much. That's really worth exploring. I mean, people coming in and saying, "I hate him, I hate her," that just gets me because underneath that is like so much hurt, and the pain of an intimate relationship breaking up that they're recovering from, and then at the same time, their children are experiencing it in a completely different way because your ex who hurt you so much and betrayed you and did whatever they did, and I've seen it with men and women, feeling betraying, and yet they're still your child's other parent.
That's right. That's right.
And
And if I could add what we know a long, long time ago, and I'll mention names. So, dear Abby, for those of you who read her column, she wrote a column about the fact that children know that they are a part of both of you. And so if you dislike or even hate, that's a very strong word, but we hear it a lot, hate the other parent, then children can internalize that as if you hate that person, I look like them, I act like them.
yeah,
They're a part of I'm a part of them and they're a part of me. So do you hate me too? And we have to really pay attention to that. The other thing that I recognize that oftentimes our clients don't, I'm sure you do, Rachel, is that a bad partner or spouse doesn't necessarily equate to a bad parent or person.
that's
And
true.
so we really have to help people to separate that out, to really kind of deconstruct their pain and recognize the potential for something better to happen. And we get to do that in the collaborative process. We get to do that outside of court. So whether it's collaborative, as you said, you're a mediator, I'm a mediator, you get to do that in a process that really takes into consideration the relational dynamics of this family. I want to also add humbly that if you read my dissertation, you'll know that really what prompted me to do this work was coming from a legacy of divorce. So, way back to my great grandparents, who divorce wasn't a thing then. However, they separated. They had high conflict. My grandparents had high conflict. My parents had high conflict. And I've been divorced as well. I come from a conflicted relationship as well, and conflicted divorce, which actually led me to the collaborative process because after that, I recognized the destruction of my family and recognized there has to be a better way and I have to find it. And for me, there was a lot of healing in that. Each family that I work with helps me to heal as well from the trauma of a destructive divorce process that really emerges in most cases out of anger and resentment and betrayal and ineffective guidance. Sometimes, as you know, Rachel, sometimes we are really led when we're in a very vulnerable place. We're led in a direction that leads us to think we have to fight for what is rightfully ours, whether it's our children or money or a house or whatever. And I think what we learn ultimately is that fight doesn't result in a win. It doesn't ever result in a win.
Just the focus on the conflict and on the destruction and kind of the churning of the feelings over and over and over and over, like the loop that your brain gets into when you're in conflict with somebody. I think there's a tendency of all of us to like just repeat our arguments.
Right.
And that makes us feel like we're strengthening our arguments, but it's actually having a destructive effect on the person who's walking around holding on to that anger. I remember myself discovering this some years ago when I had a conflict with UPS about some packages that were lost and that caused me tremendous inconvenience. And I had been presenting at a conference and the materials didn't get there in time. So it was like a professional, I reconstructed it enough, but it was a very difficult issue. And I remember walking down the street and just spewing this anger in my head, going over like how wrong they were and how right I was. And they owed me. And suddenly I said, I'm walking down the street. It's a beautiful day. I'm not arguing with UPS right now, except I'm carrying this in my head and I'm just spinning it around and around and around and around. And, it was like eye-opening. I realized that I was carrying this conflict in my heart and nobody was yelling at me at that moment. Like I didn't have to be arguing in my head, and I realized like conflict is addictive, I think, in some ways. And our litigation system just hammers that over and over and over again.
It does. It perpetuates and it feeds. I say puts gasoline on the fire for sure. And I also, what you're saying reminds me of a saying, which is so significant. I'm guessing you've heard it. Carrying around that anger is like drinking poison and hoping the other person is going to die. And the reality is that's not how it happens. It really affects our soul. And then when we talk about the ramifications for children, what we also know is that angry parents really can't be good parents. And they definitely can't be good co-parents because they're carrying so much of their own stuff that they really can't attend to the children's needs. I know that most parents would say, oh, no, I put my children's needs first all of the time. And I think the intention is to do that. However, when you're so distracted, but like you said, those angry feelings and those angry thoughts, it's very, very hard to put anyone else's needs before your own because you're hyper focused on those feelings. And so sorting those through really can help you to show up in your world, at work, with your children, with your friends, with your colleagues in a better way, in a much, much better way.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you get a situation where, somebody says someone's so angry and hurt that they can't think of it from their child's perspective. And they say things like, well, I have to tell my child the truth of the divorce. I have to tell my child what a untrustworthy slut their mother is because I'm not going to lie to my child, and
Right.
and they're not at all thinking about what a child wants to hear and is developmentally ready to hear. I always tell people, no, I think children always know the truth of their parents' divorce. It's like a puzzle that they're going to put together. And when they get into their 20s and 30s, they're going to still be thinking about things that happened when they were children and suddenly see it with adult eyes and go, that's what was going on. But you don't have to tell them when they're 9.
Right. Because as you say, they'll then be developmentally ready to process it. When their mind can process it, it means that they're ready to process it and or ready to get help with processing it, right? But when they're children, they can't make sense of it. The only thing children want to know is that both their parents love them, that their life is not going to significantly change, even though, one might say, how is that possible that their life isn't going to significantly change from a divorce? But we want to help parents to work together to keep things as consistent as possible for children, to keep things as peaceful as possible for children so that they don't experience those loyalty conflicts, the feeling that they have to protect one parent from the other or love one parent more than the other, or that they can't love both their parents. Because to my mind, that's what perpetuates the relationship issues that they have later on in life. And so the process of creating a context for a peaceful divorce, to my mind, is the most significant thing we can do to change the trajectory of families.
So when you say change the conversation so that they're focused on having a peaceful divorce, is it just educating them? I mean, I guess that's part of it. That, part of it is educating them, I guess, and also trying to help support them to have other venues they need to express those emotions,
Sure.
but they just shouldn't be expressing them to their children. They should have a therapist. They should have their friends, their cousins, their neighbor, whoever it is. We call it sometimes the Greek chorus of people who are there listening and telling you helping you decide what to do. But, your children are not your confidants. They're experiencing this in their own way.
That's right.
And confiding in them can help can make them feel put in the middle.
Yeah, I just think it's too much for them to hold. When we put them in the middle, I think, kids need to be able to be kids. And I'm speaking about whether they are small children, whether they are emerging adult children, whether they're adult children going off to college. We can call those emerging adult children as well. And or whether they're, back and starting life and starting their own relationships and families. I think that what happens with their core family impacts every step along the way, because children want to know that both their parents love them, that they have the right to love both of their parents, that they don't have to resolve their parents' conflict, that they don't have to decide who's right and who's wrong. That's a gift to them. That's a relief for them to know that they can live their lives. Parents will, I think, create a process where they can transition in their lives as children, not as children of divorce, if you will, if that makes sense.
So did you, how old were you when your parents separated?
So when my parents got divorced, I was 13.
That's very hard.
It was a tough age. I was an adolescent. And what I'll tell you is that there was a tremendous amount of conflict in my home. The day that my dad was was moving, sorry, I remember it as if it was yesterday. My dad was leaving and he was packing, which, by the way, I emphasize repeatedly that no parent should do that in front of a child, packing to leave. He didn't know. There was no manual back then.
Right.
It was in the 70s. He didn't know. So he was leaving, and I experienced a multitude of emotions simultaneously. And again, I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a relief that the fighting might stop. It was sadness that he was moving out. It was fear about what's going to happen to my life. And it was shame because in the early 70s, a lot of people weren't getting divorced. It was still at that time, late 60s, early 70s, try to remember, but people weren't getting divorced so regularly. As a matter of fact, I remember that my parents started a trend because they were the first on the block. And then after that, the whole block started getting divorced. I think they gave everybody permission. But I do remember as a 13-year-old getting on the school bus and thinking, who's going to know? What's it going to be like? How am I going to explain this to people? And then thinking I had to take care of my mother because she was kind of left alone. And thinking I was supposed to be angry with my father because he did all these terrible things, not knowing what was going to happen to me in my life. And so experiencing that really, I think, set the context for my wanting to help other families because I remember it, as I've said 3 times now.
Yeah.
It was yesterday.
Well, it was only like 10, 15 years ago, right?
That's right, Rachel. Thank you. That's why I love you. One of the many reasons why I love you. Yes. So, and it's embedded. It's embedded in my skin.
Yeah.
And so I can caution parents about the ramifications for children from a real life perspective. Now, of course, and I've had to learn this in my work as a clinician, in my training, in my work, in my supervision, that not every family is like me and not every child is going to experience things the way I did. However, what I experience is pretty consistent with what's in the literature. We now know that children from high conflict families are not okay. And they don't know how to function in relationship and they don't know how to be okay. And they have this terrible fear of being abandoned or being hurt or being left. And they have issues with attachment and issues with safety and issues with loyalty, those kinds of things. Way back, Judith Wallerstein did a study on children of divorce. And and she talked about as the outcome of her study that children of divorce would be damaged goods, if you will, and that they would be the children who would get involved in drugs and promiscuity and gang and all of those terrible things that we worry about with our children. However, later studies discovered that the subjects who were in Wallerstein's study really came from families where there was a lot of bad things happening way before the divorce. And so these children were impacted by that and then doubly impacted by their divorce. There then came a woman named Constance Ahrens, who followed up. She just recently passed away, but she followed up and did longitudinal studies. She coined the term called the good divorce. And what she discovered was when parents can co-parent effectively, allow children to love both parents the same or differently as they do, but allowing them to love both parents, allowing them to be kids and not to worry about how this was going to impact their lives and keep things as consistent as possible and restructure a family so they still felt like they had a family. These kids did well and they became adaptable and they became flexible and they became well functioning in life. So, people call my office and they say, is there really such a thing as the good divorce? And it's not as if we advocate for divorce. However, we do know that there's a better way. And
there's a better way to do it.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's really the high conflict that causes the negative outcomes for the children. And if you can kind of form a frame, the children are still in one family that's still, it's in 2 homes, but it's one family with the same frame around it, and that they're allowed to love the other parent, and that the parents are not using them as messengers and saying, you tell your mother, you tell your father this, and they don't quiz them when they come home.
That's right.
What did you do with your father? But instead, like the Children's Bill of Rights that I put in every agreement that I write, just as a reminder to parents of think about how this looks for your children from their perspective.
Right. And we have that saying, what's the narrative you want your children to tell their children about their parents' divorce? How do you want them to reflect back? How do you want them to remember it? And how do you want to honor your parents for doing the right thing when they were getting divorced and not putting you in the middle? How do you want your children to honor you and respect you and look at you for really, really putting them first? And that's a hard thing.
I've had multiple prenups that I've done, and I say, why are you doing the prenup? And they say, well, in my parents' divorce, this happened, and I cannot get married without finding a way to ensure that will not happen to me. That, my mother screwed over my father, and he was, suffering living in one room with a cot while she had the house. And I just have to make sure that result isn't going to happen to me.
That's right. And I think as you're talking, what's coming to mind for me is the word fear. So I think most people who are going through this process in a contentious way are experiencing that contention or even causing that contention because of fear, right? The unknown is so scary. What's going to happen to my life? How am I going to manage? Why are you doing this to me? Kind of thing. How am I going to live? And I think that is what I think triggers the animosity and the conflict. And so if we can help clients to really understand what needs to be in place for them to feel safe, feel capable of moving forward, they do better. And I think that is where we as professionals can really help them. We can, we can't right the emotional wrongs. However, if we can create a context of safety for them to move forward, I think that they can go through a better process. And then, of course, if they have children, their children will go through a better process as well. And I want to say that I've worked on many, many divorce matters where there are no children.
Yeah.
However, I think the important thing about that and helping people is to help people to become more whole so that they don't repeat the same patterns in their next relationship that they experienced in this relationship.
Right.
And that's
I found most people, if they don't have children, they were once children. So the experience of children is still relevant.
Yes, that's really true. Really true.
Now, did you have a litigated divorce yourself? And also, did your parents have litigated divorces that went on for a long time?
My parents' divorce, I think it was pretty simple. I think my mother didn't know enough, and I think neither of them really knew enough, and even in later conversations with my father, like, how did the timeshare arrangement, if you will, I didn't even know that's what you call it, but how did that get decided? Or, how was X decided or Y decided? They didn't have anybody guiding them. Really, they didn't really know. So I think it was kind of simple. My own divorce was before I knew anything about collaborative divorce. And being a clinician, and this is an interesting, I think, point. So being a clinician, other clinicians who are working with families who are going through divorce, or all of us as clinicians, if you don't know any better and you want to help your client, you're going to send them to the strongest, most powerful divorce attorney that you know to try to protect your client and help them to go through this process in a successful way, if you will. That's a oxymoron. And so what I now know was that I listened to people who thought they were helping me and sent me in the direction of a highly contentious litigator who they thought was going to protect me, who ended up really contributing to the destruction of my family.
Yeah.
And the reality is, I recognized after my ex-husband and he stormed out of the mediation. We got in contact right after the mediation. We settled our divorce at the valet stand in front of a hotel in our neighborhood because the mediation had gone so badly that we were both just destroyed. And he contacted me after and said, let's talk. And we did. And we resolved it at that moment in time. And I realized there has to be a better way. There has to be a better way for families. And I began exploring it. And unfortunately, too late for my immediate family. However, really learning about this process, as I said earlier, and working in this process of alternative dispute resolution, these processes has really been healing for me in a lot of ways, because you don't know what you don't know. But now that I know, I try to help families to do it better and differently.
Yeah.
And I think that's core, because
Yeah.
a lot of families, they don't know any better than I did. Or a lot of clinicians, a marriage counselor is the first person who's going to know you're getting divorced, right? And if they want to help you, they're going to help you in the best way they know how. But that's why we do these podcasts, right? That's why we educate the public, because we want professionals and the public to know there is a better way.
Yeah. I mean, the whole idea of the adversarial system for families just has never made sense to me at all, because you're still, you're still going to be, I mean, even if you have, if you have a child or children, you're always going to be connected to your children. But even if you don't, this person is always going to be an important part of your history. You'll have spent years of your life with this person, and you can't throw that away. You can't go back to college and not meet him, or her. I mean, you can't, they're always going to be an important part of your history. And why would you want to now, as you said, throw gasoline on it and set it on fire? I like to say, I don't want you to look back in 5 years and wince when you think of how you behaved around the end of this relationship.
Right. And I say to that point, and I am once again going to be vulnerable here. I do so because I want my words maybe to resonate with someone out there, that, I really felt that it was wronged, let's just say. And so that fighting back was the only approach. And what I say now, having learned so much about the collaborative process and seen in other alternative dispute methods as well, how people can really, really come together in a better way, I realize that I didn't know any better. And because I didn't know any better, I didn't do anything differently. But now what I know is that if I had known better, I would have gone through not only my divorce differently, I would have been married differently as well. I definitely would have gotten divorced anyway. However, I would have been married differently. Leading up to the divorce would have been different, and the divorce itself would have been different. And so that would have really created a different context for my own child. And so that is an important notion as well.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I always think of it as like we're all the star of our own movie. And even when somebody feels very betrayed, and you can hear the story from their perspective and feel like, oh my God, you married a cad, an evil person who really did not wish you well, and who went out of their way to hurt you. But then if you hear the story from their perspective, they were suffering in their own way. And, I think really most people are doing the best they can, given who they are and given their journeys through life. And I mean, some of the most magical moments that I've had in alternative dispute resolution is when somebody suddenly, I'm trying to get an understanding of the other, in collaborative. I do this as well, even though my client is sitting next to me and I'm their attorney, but I want to know what their spouse's perspective is as well, because it will help us to try to find common ground. And when I can get that insight and realize, like, they weren't just having a piece of cake either. And it just sort of shifts everything, so that you're not talking about like one selfish, evil person and the other is all giving and all generous. Instead, the reality is somewhere in the middle, and it's a little more nuanced. And I mean, that kind of empathy also can help you to shift the conversation to being like, okay, maybe I don't have to destroy you in order to move forward with everything.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're so right. And, I say to the couples who I work with respectfully, nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing happens in isolation. And every action in an entity of a relationship is an invitation for a response or a reaction from another person. And so when people realize that they are a contributor to the problem, they can also be a contributor to the solution, because they're not thinking of themselves as being persecuted and being a victim and having to fight back and all of that dynamic. And so it's a very challenging, let's just say, theory to present to people, because if they're feeling hurt or they're feeling betrayed or they're feeling wounded, they don't want to hear that they had a part in contributing to that. But just by virtue of the fact that they were present in that relationship, that presence contributed to that, right? So I try to help them to recognize that they can contribute to the solution as well, even if they felt like they were the wounded party. We as professionals, we come in the middle of their movie. You said that too. You're an actor in your movie. We come in the middle of their movie. So if you think about turning on the TV and catching the middle of a movie, you kind of have to figure out what came before. However, when you're figuring that out, you're doing so based on your own frame of reference, right? So we're bringing our assumptions into the room. We're trying to figure out what happened. We're trying to figure out who did what, when, and how. However, if we recognize that everybody's a contributor and everybody's responsible, then we're not aligning with one person or another, which is what you're saying. Even as an advocate, as the attorney, you're not aligning because you recognize there are two parts to this story, right? Actually, probably many more parts to this story than the one narrative that you're hearing. And that's, I think, the best thing that you can do as an attorney when you're listening to your client's narrative is knowing that there's more to it than that. And in doing so, you're not pouring the gasoline on, you're kind of diffusing the flame.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that's always a difficult line as an attorney in the
Sure.
filing process to walk, because I have to make my clients' priorities my priorities, and I have to make sure my client feels that I'm supporting them and understanding them. And I have to lay that groundwork first so they feel like I'm on their side and they can trust me before I can start. I mean, I think you as a family specialist and a coach might be able to do that better, as far as like opening up their eyes to think about their marriage in a different way, and perhaps their divorce, is an opportunity for them to change their relationship and perhaps do it differently.
For sure. And actually, with that said, I want to throw a plug in for the benefits of a family specialist being just that. I can say things to the clients that attorneys may not be able to say, because your clients are looking to you to support them and be their advocates. And so, of course, subtly, you can address the entire family system. I can do that more directly because I'm not supposed to be on anyone's side.
Right. You're neutral and you're looking at it from kind of a bird's eye view, looking at the whole family system. Yeah.
That's right. So even in terms of parenting, I can say things to them in terms of parenting, children's needs, bringing children's voices into the process. I can say some things that perhaps an attorney who is supposed to be on their side might not be able to say.
Yeah.
If I do it in a way that they can hear it. And that's a skill that I have to work towards all the time.
Right. Yeah. So if there were, let's say, 3 things that you could say to parents who are have just decided that they're going to separate, what are your 3 like takeaways that you would want them to have from this podcast? And I know I'm just asking you this off the cuff. You may not.
No, I can tell you.
I'm sure you can come up with them, but
I probably can give you 100, but I'll give you. So 3, of course. First and foremost, if you have children, really try to see this divorce from their eyes, from their perspective. How is this divorce ultimately going to impact their lives emotionally, financially, and relationally? what is the outcome you want for your children. So that's one, allowing them to love both of their parents, not having to be the better parent in their eyes, because children need both their parents to be the best parents they can be. And that conflict doesn't solve the pain and the hurt and the wounds of divorce. It actually, I believe, keeps them alive. And anger keeps, like you shared in your story about the UPS, it keeps it in your soul. It keeps it in your blood. It keeps it alive. That fight, that conflict, that anger, that hostility, it just keeps everything alive, as opposed to healing it, getting closure, and moving forward in peace. That's what I think.
Yeah. Well, those are great takeaways, Randy. I thank you so much for joining me this morning on this podcast. I feel like I could talk to you for another hour to just talk about this work, because I can see that it moves you the way that it moves me. You know, I so want to help people through I've gone through my own painful breakups, and I know how hard it is. And I just so want to help people know that they can come out the other side and they'll be okay, and their kids can be okay, and, you know, life can be okay again.
Yeah, that's so true. And I thank you so much for bringing me on, because I believe that too. I truly, in my heart of hearts, that children who come from a good divorce, or people who go through a good divorce, if you will, and that means peaceful in my mind, really, really can move forward in a more peaceful way in their lives, be more productive, functioning members of society, which this is a lofty goal, but to my mind, changes the world one family at a time.
That's great. Thanks, Randy.
Thank you so much.